Welcome to FACT's webinar called Choosing the Right Animal for the Right Place at the Right Time. This webinar is hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust and is the third and final installment in our Silvopasture webinar series. Our presenter today is Steve Gabriel with Wellspring Forest Farm. I am Larissa McKenna. I'm FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating today's session. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Just a few quick introductions. I'll take a minute here to tell you a little bit about FACT. We are a national nonprofit organization that's headquartered in Illinois. We do work across the country, and we promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. And I have the honor and pleasure of working in FACT's Humane Farming Program, working with farmers across the country to provide a number of services, including grants, scholarships, personalized materials. We have a mentorship program, and of course we have webinars like this on a variety of topics. So I invite you to visit our website, and I'll include a link in my follow-up email as well, to learn all about our farmer services, including our farmer grants, our Fund to Farmer grants, for which we are currently accepting applications. So this time I'm very, very pleased to introduce our wonderful presenter, Steve Gabriel. Steve is an agroforestry extension specialist for the Cornell Small Farms Program. He's also managing editor of Small Farms Quarterly. He's written several books about silvopasture, and along with his wife, Liz, he operates Wellspring Forest Farm and School in the Finger Lakes region of New York. So we're really lucky to have Steve again with us this week, third week in a row. He's going to be sharing a lot of experience and expertise. And so I think at this point, without any further ado, I'm going to pass the virtual mic over to you, Steve. So take it away.
Okay, let me know you can hear me all right.
I can hear you.
All right, let me just get my slides up here. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar today. There we go. All right, we should do our slides here. Okay, let me know if that doesn't look good from your end. Thanks for having me back again. So we're going to continue and take another branch on the tree of silvopasture and talk about. We've been focused the last couple of weeks on a lot about the trees. And that element of the ecosystem, and we're going to focus a bit more on the animals today and talk about where animals fit into silvopasture. And a lot of great questions that came in ahead of time. I'll try to took some notes and try to touch on things as best I can. Happy to field some questions as well as much as we have time for, but there's a lot to dig into. And so what's most important to me is to emphasize a couple of the overarching and kind of key patterns and encourage everyone to think about these bigger picture items. We tend to get really focused in on like which animal is right, or how many animals per acre, or these kind of like detail oriented questions. The danger in that is missing some of the overarching concepts that are really important to having whatever type of animal you end up with in your grazing ecosystem. So just a little more about me. I have experience in and a background in forestry and forest ecology, and I brought that to farming and agriculture. We steward about 50 acres or so on our land and up the road that we lease. We do a bunch of different activities. Our forest is grounded in the concept of agroforestry, which I'll talk a bit about. I've written a couple of books to share and to try to pull out what's known about there and what's not known about this practice, which is an old practice. And you can find more about my work at the farm website there, and also the book website, where you can order a copy directly from me if you're so inclined. And I, in addition to being a farmer, really see myself as an educator. So supporting folks to learn more and passing on knowledge, not just from what I've learned, but also from so many other great folks along the way, whether I met them, taken classes from them, or read their work or saw their videos. So this is a collective effort, and certainly the writing of a book was an attempt to bring together hundreds of different voices to share what we know and don't know about silvopasture and other aspects of agroforestry. Our farm does a lot of different things. Grazing and silvopasture is just one piece. Mushroom production is actually a large chunk of where we find our revenue, as well as some of these other products, maple syrup, agritourism. We have Maple Festival every year. In most years, we have some summer rentals, and folks can come visit the farm and spend some time there. So we have a small diversified farm, and my wife and I are both also employed part-time as agricultural educators in different capacities. So we're really lucky because if we're not doing the farm work, we're talking and supporting others to do that as well. So that's really been our focus. I like to always presence that we're on land that has an indigenous story, just like you are on land that has an indigenous story. Anywhere you find yourself on Earth, it has that. And we're actually at the sort of center of a really difficult and challenging and intense story of what happened in the past with the displacement and dispossession of land of what's known maybe more commonly as the Iroquois, but the Haudenosaunee would be the Confederacy of the Six Nations. The Cayuga or Goyimkono, which is their name and their language, are the lands that we find ourselves on today. And so what's important from my relationship with the Goyimkono people is to pass along that their story and other indigenous stories are not a history lesson. They very much have a present, and they very much have a future. And part of being on land and part of farming, I believe, is to understand that story that's unique to your area and to try to connect with the individuals and to learn how to support them to find sovereignty in the ways that they want to pursue. And that's something we're actively doing with Goyimkono neighbors around us in central New York. Our farm is really grounded in the idea of leaving a forest in the footsteps of agriculture, so that when we walk off the farm, one way or the other, a forest is left behind us, as opposed to what we found when we encountered the landscape, which was kind of a beat up, degraded landscape where there was a stark divide between pasture and forest, and both had been pretty heavily abused. The forest had been heavily logged, and all the best trees, many of the best trees, I should say, taken for various things. So what was left needed some support, rehabilitation, and then the fields were pretty heavily compacted, a lot of water issues, low organic matter in the soil, all those kind of things. So for us, the act of farming is also an act of restoration work in the landscape. And I think silvopasture arguably is one of the best ways to enact that kind of activity on a broad scale. Our mushroom farming is really great. It has some other kind of ecological benefits, but it certainly can't impact 50 acres worth of land. But once we bring the sheep and the ducks and our sort of grazing into it, we can actually change that pretty dramatically. We've been on this land for close to 10 years and seen some pretty dramatic results. So some big picture things to chew on, and we'll dig into some of the details and the nuances, but of this list, but I want to kind of provide this at the outset. When we say right animal, right place, and right time, what's important is that we don't come, in my experience, to a piece of land with a species or a subspecies, a breed or something already in our mind. We don't predetermine that. We think about the unique context we're in on the landscape, and we think about how to match the animal to that context. And that animals or those animals may not, always be there. There might be a reason to bring certain animals in for a period of time, but they may not necessarily be able to be sustained on that landscape indefinitely. So I challenge you to question your assumptions about the animals that you have been thinking about or do have, and consider the different pros and cons, because these animals all have a role in their ecosystem, and they can do great good, and they can also do harm. All the animals carry those traits, just like humans, as it turns out. We can do either of those things on land. So we look at the ecological succession, and we match the species and even the breed to the land and the stage of succession of the ecosystems that we're working with. We move the animals, we give the land time to rest, and make sure that that's a priority. Whether there's trees in that landscape or not, it doesn't matter. When we're looking at forages and pasture, we need to be rotationally grazing if we're going to have a positive effect in the long term. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between ruminants and monogastrics, meaning animals with a single stomach versus multi-chambered stomachs. Essentially, the ruminants would be your your cows, goats, sheep, things like that. And then we have our pigs and poultry, being the major monogastrics that folks are thinking about with livestock. I always encourage folks when I'm working with them to think, and if you've heard my past talks, I think a lot about habitat as the context for how I want to engage with animals in the landscape. And we'll get a bit more into that about why this is important in a little bit. Leveraging the skills of the livestock and knowing what problematic traits they offer. And this can sometimes be within the specific species, but also within the particular breed. I see the smug look on that goat's face in there, and I know that he has certain desires in that landscape that might not be something that the landowner is interested in having him do. But there's also things he can do that are really wonderful for the landscape. And that's the goal, is to fit those two things together and make sure it's a positive effect. I already mentioned number 6, that some animals could be sustained year after year and others maybe as a pulse. And then we'll talk a bit about behavior-based management, which I think is one of the things I found in researching the Silvopasture book was something I really missed when I first got into livestock. And it's something that we're really trying to learn more about and integrate more into our thinking around our animals on the farm. So from an ecological perspective, what animals do in the environment, including humans, of course, we can't keep ourselves out of this, but we're thinking about livestock, so I'll keep to that. Anytime an animal enters any part of the land, they enact a disturbance on that land. And so that ecologically, a disturbance is actually often a catalyzing event to create more species diversity, to create more soil health, to do good things long-term for the ecosystem. Sometimes in the short term, it doesn't look so pretty. And sometimes in the short term, it can look just fine. But if we start to think about our animals entering a certain part of our land as a disturbance event, the question really is, what's the duration and intensity of that disturbance? And what's the possible set of positive and negative consequences? Because we can then, our role is really to enact and support disturbances that offer the best benefit to the land, at the same time offer the best benefit to the animals. And at the end of the day, what the animals are doing as they, quote unquote, disturb the land is they're looking to sustain their own needs, their own sustenance, their own interest in not just feeding themselves as if us as humans only wanted to feed ourselves. We like to go out, eat a meal, relish in it, enjoy the flavors. Well, animals actually have a lot of those tendencies too. So it's not just about sustaining a certain amount of calories. It's actually also about the way the animals experience the landscape, and we'll get a bit more. So I'd argue that this is not a landscape that is very stimulating, exciting, or nourishing for animals, both in the type of food that's offered and the type of landscape. We could barely call this a habitat. It's analogous to a parking lot where we just don't have a lot going on. This is not where these animals come from, and it's certainly not something that's creating any sense of fulfillment or sustenance, as we'll get into. So when I think of silvopasture, I try to define it as from the goals that I set forth. And it's really important for you to reflect on your own personal goals and use that as your orienting compass. There's no right set of goals. But for me, my goal is to restore the ecosystem of the farm and create livestock habitat. So for me, silvopasture is that practice of ecological restoration as we create livestock habitat. And on our farm and many silvopastures, we can kind of come at that from two different directions. We can look at woodlots and woodlands that are dominated by woody species, and we can open up the canopy, bring more light into the understory, create the conditions, and develop good forages in the understory and create good habitats for our animals. Not all forests should be converted in that way. I think the healthier and older the forest is, the less the animals should be in there, because we really need to preserve and protect the oldest, healthiest forests in our ecosystems. There's less and less of them every day and every year. But there's a lot of mid to low grade quality forests, and these are phenomenal places and actually can benefit tremendously from silvopasture in the long term. And likewise, in the pasture, we can bring trees into the pasture and have some benefits there as well. So silvopasture really comes at it from these two directions. And there's, as we've talked about in the previous webinars, a lot of different nuances to each of these approaches. So you might find yourself utilizing kind of both of these or just one of these kind of directions as you think about silvopasture. One might feel easier or harder to you, and that's perfectly fine. It all depends on the context. So silvopasture is really about the linkages and the intersection between the forages, the livestock, and the trees. And our job, in my mind, is to be the conductor. We get them all together in the right place so that they all can benefit each other. If we miss a step or we do our job poorly, then damage happens. Somebody gets sick, somebody dies, something gets trampled, something doesn't come back the following year, something gets stripped of its bark and doesn't come back, something like that. As we go. And for us also, as animal stewards, it's really important for us to not see our animals only as commodities, as units that we raise and then sell. We grapple with the challenge of harvesting and slaughtering animals and recognize the larger benefits to a healthy flock that we've built over the last decade. And in that choice is also the choice where we have to sort of play predator and grapple with the challenge of removing animals from the landscape on an annual basis. And so we think a lot about how animals have a good quality of life, whether they're there for 6 months or 6 years. And these 5 freedoms are a really interesting thing to reflect on and kind of think about as a checklist for how we're doing in terms of welfare on our animals. Welfare certification is a great thing. There's a long list of detailed things in here, but these 5 things are really what are key to finding good animals that I think are taken care of well in the landscape. So that's something we orient and look at constantly and think about, kind of grade ourselves in how we're doing with some critical thinking. So animals and crops, whether those trees are for conservation, whether they're for future timber or wood products, whether they're for nuts or fruit or something like that. One of the questions is, well, why would we want to bring animals into it? And so, one of the things that animals do in the landscape, of course, is cycle fertility. And that's one of the major benefits of bringing animals and cycling them through our different tree-based systems is we get that cycling of fertility. And that looks different for the different animals. So for monogastrics, we're often bringing in grains. We're often bringing in outside energy sources. They're consuming those and they're depositing them on the landscape. And so I see our grain purchases for our ducks as a fertility input into our landscape because we move them around and that fertility becomes beneficial to restoring the old degraded haylands that we inherited. Ruminants have a wonderful ability to take the on-site resources, all the greenery, and to one degree or another convert that into fertility and unlock a lot of the nutrients and things that are locked up in those plants. And so this is a benefit that is something that we definitely cannot do. We can buy in fertilizer, we can spread it on the land, but we certainly don't have a way with any machine or our own ability as humans to take green material and turn it into fertilizer. And that's really what the ruminants offer us. But beyond that, there's a lot of different skill sets that these animals possess. So this is a chart from the Silvopasture book that tries to summarize. And so depending on the types of services or support practices you're looking for, you can think about the ways these different animals can fit in and or potentially not work, depending. So if you want tillage, there's a couple animals that do well, and there's ones that just aren't going to offer you a lot in that realm, for instance. Another factor I want you to think about too is with silvopasture, I've just found this time and time again, often people think about if they're going to add trees into their farm and with their grazing animals, they're thinking about fruit and nut trees, but that adds another layer of management because those trees require extra care if you're going to get a good yield from them. And so we've seen over time that sometimes people want to focus on a tree crop system, fruit or nuts, where animals might provide some sort of support service, and we'll look at some examples of that. Or maybe you're more focused on a livestock system where the trees support the animals. There's definitely systems that do both, but it's important to recognize where you're coming from. It's very labor, material, and time intensive to have both a scalable livestock enterprise and a successful tree crop enterprise that both require a lot of management. The density of animals you might need to have a good livestock enterprise may not match up with the needs, for instance, in your orchard for fertility or pest control or something like that, right? So often if it's a tree crop-based systems, you need a lot less animals to do the support services. But if you're doing a livestock system, you might need more animals to justify it from an economic perspective. So I just throw that out there that it's not always that all of those things need to mesh together. And it's important for you to reflect on your goals and think where you might be coming from, because it really dictates how we design and create. So for us, the reason that trees and our livestock are together, well, the trees have the conservation benefits and the kind of ethic that we want to put forth on our farm. And they also provide shade, shelter, and fodder for our livestock. Those are the main reasons we plant trees. So it really shrinks down the list. Of the hundreds and hundreds of trees that we're planting on our landscape, most are fast-growing, short-lived, and very browse-adapted species like this black locust. We have maybe 25 fruit trees. The ducks do a lot of work in the orchard, but that's not the main focus of our grazing enterprise. And certainly those 25 trees take 10 times more work than the hundreds of other trees that we have scattered throughout the rest of the landscape, right? So reflect on your goals, think about it, and use that as a way to filter and to support a reasonable approach to this, because it's very easy to think and dream, but we have to act on the land, and it can very quickly become overwhelming. So a question I always ask when I'm in a room with folks, and we're kind of in the digital space now, and I can't actually see the chat, so I won't pause for this one, but I want you to think about, and I always ask this question, when does it count as rotational grazing? If I said that rotational grazing is a must for silvopasture-based systems, when does that count? How do I know when it's time to move these animals to that next paddock in this case? Looking at or observing or thinking about the basics. And if you haven't checked out Sarah Flack's presentations, I know that was a series that FACT did in the past, I would really recommend getting into that. So we often go off some basic rules of thumb, or sort of when we feel like it, or in some cases it's like we move them when we have time, and that's usually not the best way. What we want to look at is the ecological disturbance and how the system is responding. And so often looking at the grasses and seeing where they're at, we could talk about that, as a rough rule of thumb in terms of height. We can look at it in terms of the number of bites the animals have taken. And we can think about the number of days. So a lot of grasses and clovers and things like that, some of our valuable food sources, after they've been nipped off, if it's been 3 to 4 days after that first grazing event, those plants are trying to regenerate and regrow again. And if the animals are in the same space with those plants, they're going to go back and take another bite. And that can, over time, really deplete the reserves of that plant and often kill it altogether from the system. So 3 to 4 days is a good starting point to understand if your animals are in a given place, you want to move them on and allow that pasture to rest, restore, and regenerate. So sometimes you see the height of the grass being an indicator of that. That can be useful. But it's really important to size your paddocks and the relationship of the number of animals you have, the quality of the forage, and trying to hit that kind of 3 to 4 day window ideally, right? So I don't consider rotational grazing personally if you rotate once a month or once every 6 months, because you're not getting the benefit of that rest period. Just as important that those grasses rest, as much as it's important for them to actually be grazed. And in this case, this is very early on in our grazing experience here. We have a pretty small paddock, because we have a pretty small flock. And we also have a really low quality forage here. This pasture has become much more productive over the years as we've grazed it and rested it and regenerated, probably twice as productive as it was in this photo. But it's not something that we got to right away. So we had to size and create the disturbance that was matching to that stage of the land's succession. Fencing is something I saw a few people ask questions about. What is the job of fencing? The job of fencing is both to keep animals where we want them and also to keep them out of where we don't want them. And the fencing question is something that I think is, my grandfather was a farmer and had livestock, and he didn't have a lot of options. He basically had barbed wire as his fencing system. So the scale of fencing, the divisions of paddocks, the rotational grazing that we're talking about, that was all a lot harder to do just several decades ago. But we've really run into this kind of revolution in the last 10, 15 years where the technology has caught up, where we have this amazing mix of portable fencing systems that allow us, even if we have a perimeter fence that might be more permanent, to subdivide and with relative ease keep our animals in certain places and out of other places. And I miss working with cattle because you could really just get away if they were trained on the fence with a single strand, and we were able to keep them where you wanted them. With our sheep now, we use a mix of the net fencing as well as kind of multiple strand wire. And at the outset, it can feel really challenging. It took us hours in the first few years to move fencing, but now it takes us maybe half the time as we got used to it, as we got used to our paddock systems and we understood how to use it. If you haven't rolled up a net fence, really take the time to learn how to do it properly, because if you do it improperly, It's a very frustrating, silly piece of technology, but if you do it well, it works quite efficiently, and I think is great. So right now, we don't actually have any permanent fence in our system. We use all net and strand fencing to move our sheep around, and it does just fine. So beyond infrastructure, beyond goal setting, kind of some of these bigger picture things, one of the things I want to make sure we cover this afternoon is this idea of behavior-based management. And this comes from the work of Fred Provenza and a number of wonderful folks at Utah State University. I'll share some resources that you can read up on, but I want to share a couple of anecdotes, a couple of examples, because we often think of our animals as, again, sort of commodity units, and these animals need a certain amount of calories. And that's really all. And this has led us down the line of the university I work at, where a lot of the talk around livestock management is around what's sometimes called the TMR, or the total mixed ration. So this is a predetermined mixture of food that is the perfect amount of the perfect balance of things to support animals and livestock. As Fred Provenza and company started to work with livestock, he actually has a background in wildlife biology, and so was observing wild animals in the landscape and was curious why the same observations he was seeing with wild animals weren't being applied to livestock. So we have these kind of one-size-fits-all approaches. But just as an example, one of the things they noticed is that over time, some of the sheep they're working with preferred to eat clover in the morning and then grass in the afternoon. And it just started to strike a discord with this idea that, they really just need this kind of standard mixture. And they found, as they dug deeper and deeper, that animals have different dietary preferences at different times of the day, that individuals have different dietary preferences from each other. So no two sheep in the same flock have the same dietary needs at any given time. So they're all out in the landscape seeking to find balance. But it's not the balance that we can calculate on a spreadsheet. It's not the balance that we can even imagine. It's something that they can only figure out on their own. And it's sort of analogous to the fact that I don't think any of us enjoy nor do well if all we did was drink a nutrient shake every meal of the day. We need to seek out and actually find diversity of foods in our diet in order to meet our needs and keep ourselves healthy. And so this led to a whole plethora of research, and I won't have time to do it justice, but I want to mention it. And if you're going to work with livestock, I think it's really important to spend some time digging into this. So these folks have created a really wonderful website. It's called behave.net. There's a lot of summary of the research. There's a lot of accessible information. You don't have to have access to scientific journals. You don't have to dig into all that if you're not interested. We have a couple links and some of the basic journal articles on our Silvopasture book website. But read up on this, because it's a really fascinating set of information around what they call the nutritional body wisdom of the animal. And so behavior-based management is this concept that we actually manage based on what we see and understand of the particular animals in our flock or herd or group of this particular time of year, the particular situation. And that we basically try to offer them as much diversity, both within a grazing paddock, but also kind of across the landscape as we can. And so this is where Silvopasture can offer a lot. We don't want all of our paddocks to have the exact, same combination of grasses and legumes and forbs and maybe trees. We want to have a mixture and a difference throughout the entire grazing landscape. So a couple concepts with behavior-based management. One is flavor feedback. So animals learn, they gain knowledge, and this knowledge is passed on from generation to generation as they taste things, sample things, and they get that experience. You eat a meal, and if it doesn't make you feel so good, then you actually, might not go back and eat that thing the next time. It's very similar with the animals in the landscape. And if it's something that does do good, whether that's nutritionally or medicinally, they get a positive reinforcement and will come back and eat that. That information is through the research, they found it's transferred both in utero and also through mother's milk into the young offspring. And so that taste preference for different things, if a cow is familiar with eating black locust and knows that in a certain quantity at a certain time it's a good thing and has learned that, she can pass that on to her offspring, right? So they found that through the research that's true. That has some implications for the ways that we keep our mother-child pairs together, or when we separate them, right, as we go. And then the third thing that really comes out of behavior-based management is this idea of what's called satiety, or we can think of another word we might be more familiar with, which is satiation, satisfaction, right? This idea that just like we like to sit down again for, a different type of meal, something that's really tastes good and is interesting, animals actually seek this out in the landscape. So this is something that Fred observed in the wild landscape with wildlife, but then saw in the livestock world, it was completely being ignored. And I think that's really to the detriment of the health and productivity of the animals. So a lot of their justification is saying by increasing diversity, increasing the species that are available, you also increase your productive capacity of the grazing animals on your landscape. So one other anecdote, I think amazing kind of parallel to this is Fred and some other scientists spent time during this whole a 40 or 50 year journey of experiencing and learning and understanding how livestock interact with the landscape. They looked to different, indigenous forms of land management and of animal management. They spent time with French grazers who, are grazing on large, active landscapes and are considered, sort of peasant class, right? They're considered, they just kind of walk out there with the animals and they eat wherever and they do whatever, and the animals come back in and they make their living and that sort of thing. But as the scientists actually spent time with grazers, they realized very quickly it was a very intricate, specific, and highly sophisticated method of engaging with the landscape, engaging the animals in the landscape. And so I want to read this little section from a paper that where they talk about circuit grazing, because I can't do it justice if I just talk about it. So when researchers in France began to study the nutrition of livestock, they were astonished to see the levels of production that herders were able to obtain from the landscape. The researchers came to realize that the herders were using empirical understanding of complementaries among forages and landscape diversity to stimulate food intake and more fully use the range of plants available by herding in what are called grazing circuits. A circuit includes various phases, all designed to stimulate the flock's appetite and to enhance use of all the forage resources in an area. To do so, meals included a moderation phase, which provides the sheep access to plants that are abundant but not highly preferred to calm a hungry flock. The next phase is a main course for the bulk of the meal with plants of moderate abundance and preference, and then a booster phase of highly preferred plants for added diversity. And finally, often a dessert phase of palatable plants that complement previously eaten forages. Daily grazing circuits were designed to stimulate and satisfy an animal's appetite for different nutrients, and they enabled animals to maximize intake of nutrients and regulate intake of different secondary compounds, which help them kind of medicinally. Moving animals to fresh pastures, moving them to new areas of rangelands has the same effect. So one of the analogies is that the grazer, the shepherd in this case, is like a chef, creating a meal, crafting a meal, looking out of this landscape and recognizing the nuances and then targeting the animals to those different things. And so we may not find ourselves in situations where we're ranging over this much acreage, but the concept of sequencing and understanding that there's different times of day and different relationships between the types of foods animals might have access to and how well they do is a very interesting and compelling thing to consider. So one of the things that it applies to in rotational grazing is that often, late afternoon after lunch, a few hours after lunch is a great time to move the animals because they're kind of in a lull phase. Sometimes giving them a new pasture, stimulates them to eat more. Right? So we can think about the way that we relate to our landscape, we start to understand it, and we try to move the animals into those places as we go. So a couple of resources, Fred's written a couple of books. I really recommend The Art and Science of Shepherding. It really gets into some of these principles, and I think there's a lot of application to grazers of all scales. And then Nourishment talks not only about the animals themselves, but about how this relates to what we understand about human nutrition as well. He takes it to that kind of connection. And there's an excerpt from that Nourishment book, again, linked on the silvopasturebook.com website under the resource page. So there's a lot more to this. One thing I want to mention is some interesting relationships between some of the common forages that we might think about. Research has essentially showed that intake of fescues, canary grass, forages that are high in what are known as alkaloids increased when bird's foot trefoil, which is high in tannins, or alfalfa, which is high in a compound called saponins, were consumed first. So the sequence of consuming pasture heavy in the items on the left would increase the consumption of items on the right. If you went the opposite way, then intake goes down, essentially. And so I don't want you to think that you can only apply these things if you're a herder in the alpine regions of the world. This actually has application on a smaller scale. So we might have paddocks that have these kind of species composition, and we can understand a bit more about sequencing in order to improve the productive capacity of our grazing livestock. We can also use this kind of flavor feedback and behavior understanding to train our animals to either not eat certain things or to eat certain things that they may not otherwise be inclined to eat. So if an animal is only used to sitting in the barn and eating alfalfa pellets, well, they're not going to take to the pasture, and they're going to be pretty picky in what they eat. And so it really comes down to their culture, what they're used to, what kind of foods they've eaten their whole lives. This is another paper from University State. This is actually something you can Google and find online. It actually gives you the recipe for how to do this, specifically how to train livestock to avoid specific forages. In this case, grape leaves is what is used as the example. So obviously some benefits to having sheep in a vineyard, but not such a beneficial opportunity if the animals strip and eat the grape leaves, which is usually a preferred forage. And so the basic idea is you create a scenario where the animals graze, and you actually give a small subset of the animals the lithium chloride, a little bit of dose of that, which gives them kind of an upset stomach. So you're actually kind of tricking their responses to suddenly give them a little bit of an upset stomach. And over time they learn, and then you send them back with the flock, and the whole flock is then trained over time to avoid this forage, right? So this is a practice that's been proven, and this resource will help spell out what that looks like if that's of interest. And on the flip side, Kathy Voth, she has a great online resource called On Pasture. She also has a book and some information about teaching cows, and this would apply to other animals to eat weeds. So how to introduce and support them to eat things that they might try to avoid, in this case, a nice thistle there. So just to put out there, you can definitely work on this. It's not like you can just immediately put the animals in there and expect them to do it. It takes some training, some understanding, but it can be done. And it's all based on this idea of understanding animal behavior and how you can work with it. So let's talk about some specific animals in different contexts, and we'll provide a few examples of how they fit, where they might fit into different systems, or where they might be a bit limited. So poultry as a whole, there's a lot of different ways that poultry can fit in. I think they're a great starter animal if you're new to livestock, just because of the infrastructure, the skill set, the medical care, all the kind of things are much lower in the poultry scheme. We could differentiate between poultry that have webbed feet versus ones that have talons, right? So our turkeys and our chickens are little tillers, versus here we have our ducks in the orchard. They're not going to go uncovering the soil, messing up the mulch. They are in the game for bugs, slugs, and other things that they can dig into the ground. So you might find if you leave animals like this that we might call waterfowl in an area for too long, they actually dig little holes or little pits because they're looking in the ground for different things to consume. So pros and cons. In our gardens, in our orchards, we found the geese and the ducks do quite well. We've had a harder time with chickens when we've had them on the farm. Geese will prefer grasses, and so it can actually be utilized to graze and to keep grasses at bay. And I'll share another example of that in a bit. Here's an example of a farm up the road from us where, again, we're thinking about cycling fertility back into the landscape. So this farm is utilizing the turkeys to spread the fertility from their manure through their orchards. Their main crop is peaches and apples for mostly cider making. The turkeys provide an additional income through the holiday sales, and they provide incredible fertility cycling as well as pest and disease control. And so they'll send them in post-harvest to pick up and break down the drops. They'll have them consuming bugs, and turkeys in particular are very precise and will find and seek out and destroy a lot of common pests. And so they can be really beneficial in the landscape. Moving them through, they are rotated through. So after the turkeys move through, this is kind of just as they're getting into a paddock. You'll know when it's ready to move them because they basically matted things down and left a nice carpet of fertility, and it's time to move them on. There's nothing for them to eat, and they're going to start to do damage and probably actually till up and expose the grass. Similarly, this farm uses geese and in an interesting system with asparagus. So asparagus, is an early spring crop. It's valuable part is harvested early on, but then its growing season is really about setting up itself for the next year's crop. And in that process, you can have a lot of issues with diseases. So the farm's using geese as a way to knock down some of that and again cycle fertility through. So you're really talking about matching the different seasonal and cyclical needs. If this crop was something that needed to be harvested later in the season, it may not work to run a bunch of poultry through because you might damage your crop, right? But things, thinking about that sequencing of the crop and the animal can be really important, and poultry can provide a really great role in that type of system. We use ducks, and we've used ducks a lot for control of our outdoor woodland mushroom growing system. If you go to wellspringforestfarm.com, we have some resources about some grant-funded research we did on this to see how we could move ducks through the mushroom landscape and reduce slug damage. And we at least anecdotally see good effect of doing this. What we realized is that in this study, we were trying to raise them for meat, and we were also trying to get them to do the pest control on the mushrooms. And what we realized is we don't need nearly as many ducks as we thought we did for the pest part of it. And the amount we needed for the meat part of it from a marketing standpoint was actually kind of exhaustive on the forest, right? So hundreds of ducks are not needed to control slugs, but they are needed in order to have a viable meat duck enterprise. So we scaled back. Now we do our ducks for eggs, and they're really on for, again, a fertility and a pest role on the landscape. And so we kind of matched, we backed off, and so we see a much more positive impact on the landscape. And the duck eggs really, for us, are a product that gets us our name out there, and it's usually a break-even product. We basically pay for the existence of the ducks by selling the eggs. We don't see it as a major profit-making enterprise, but it's something that people really enjoy, and it's something that we can use to support their existence on the farm landscape. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It's just at our scale, that's kind of where we're at. We have about 50 ducks right now and a couple geese. So the grants that we did, we have a couple reports from those about specifically raising ducks and what we learned from that, as well as about the kind of efforts. We tried to use the ducks for slug control, both in our woods for the mushrooms and also in our pasture to reduce slugs. Because you may be familiar that slugs are a carrier of the meningeal worm, the parasite that can affect small ruminants in particular. So mixed success, some challenges along the way. You can read about those in the guidebooks. They're both free to download. Okay, pigs. So in the book, I talk about this, and I always say the problem with pigs, and it's a little unfair to the pigs because the pigs are just doing what nature designed them to do, which is to root and to bulldoze and to clear land. This is what they do in ecosystems. And the challenge is we haven't seen a lot of great examples of farms who are able to deal with that skill set in a way that doesn't degrade the landscape. So that is a challenge. And it's mostly keeping pigs in one place for too long and having them really destroy the landscape. It looks like a moonscape at the end of the day. This is a farm in New York where they do a good job, and it's because they have lots of paddocks set up. They have long rest periods. It is not a 15 or 30-day rest period like with grazing animals. It's much longer than that, and they think about this disturbance event as a way to regenerate and rehabilitate areas of the farm that need the effort, right? And you have to think about your density of animals as well. So there's ways that we can integrate this. There's a couple examples of success, but the problem often is they're not going to find the majority of their diet on the landscape. It's going to be something that needs to be supplemented from outside, right, from a grain input. And often they're not rotated enough to not do serious damage. And especially in a silvopasture system, that damage can be to root systems. If we see exposed soil and exposed tree roots, you may not even see the dead trees for another 10 years, but it definitely will happen. And so more cases than not, I see that as what happens with pigs. Now, of course, pigs have a history of engagement in the larger landscape. This is the Dehesa in Spain, where the Yaman iberico, the black Iberian pigs, are well known. But these pigs were only let into these systems and continue today to only be let in when the main trees in this savanna-like ecosystem, which are oak trees, actually have a mast year and drop a lot of acorns. They were used as in a certain timing and a certain amount of food being available in the landscape, and they were not grazed through this multiple times a season, right? Maybe once a year at most. It was actually sheep that mostly maintain the grassland type pattern of this ecosystem, right? So we have to keep that in mind. Some folks to look up, Pig and Leaf and Cliff Davis in Tennessee has some material out there, does some great work thinking about and planting material and following pig activity with restoration efforts. So I'd recommend checking that out. In the Farming in the Woods book, we profiled a farm in New Hampshire. I don't know if they're still doing this, but they called this pig-powered potatoes. They had an entirely forested site where they used pigs for several years to create that initial disturbance event. They would follow them with potatoes, and then they would transition them over time to orchards or other annual productive systems. So this is a case where all they had was dense forest to start with. So pigs were a mechanism in order to open up and clear some of that land, right? I don't know if they're still on the landscape, and I know that they ebbed and flowed with their productivity and their presence of the pigs based on this need, right? So they weren't assumed to be something that was on the land necessarily every year. Ruminants. So ruminants, again, have this valuable role in that they can utilize some range of all the green stuff on the land. And some can utilize almost anything, and some are much, much more picky. And it really gets down to the individual animal and the individual breed as well. So we have a breed of sheep called Katahdins, and Katahdins are almost like goat sheep. They will equally prefer the forages on the ground as well as strip some of this material off of the woody vegetation around. So depending on what you want your animals to do and how much you want them to utilize, breed selection, as well as the flock or herd familiarity with browsing lots of different things, is a really important trait to look out for. For us in 2016, one of our big turn-ons to silvopasture was we had a historic drought in our area. These were our Katahdin sheep, and at that point, we were just learning our grazing system, and then suddenly had no grazing system. There was no forage on the ground that we had cultivated. So we sort of sent them into the hedgerows for about 45 days, and they utilized a lot of this material. So they were both willing to do it, and they were able to do it, and that's the name of the game there. This is a farm in Minnesota where sheep are used to clear the understory. This is a nut farm that does research and produces nut crops, and so the animals can be used to, maintain an understory without the need for a fossil fuel mower, right? In this case, and so these Icelandics did well with that. This farmer was not interested in the sheep getting interested in the trees, right? So this is a better breed or breed selection for this application versus the one that we are looking at on our farm. Oops. These are goats in, this is actually on a Navy base in the South, I believe in Arkansas. These are being trained and used with some of the methods I mentioned before with the cows eating my weeds to remove some invasive vegetation on this U.S. Navy base. And so this is a particular application. If we think about these different applications, here's an application where the animals it's a small amount of animals and their main goal is to support the tree crop. Here, their main goal is to grow a livestock animal for meat production and utilize whatever we can feed them on the landscape to meet our goals for production. And here we're targeting ruminants to remove a plant that we don't want to have in the landscape. The challenge with this and with doing this in particular is that the goats may not be meeting their nutritional needs. And so if they're struggling on the larger picture, they may not be as effective at targeting the individual species that you're after. And we learned this long ago at a Cornell project called Goats in the Woods, where the goal of this project was to get goats into the woods to help actually strip the bark of beech and striped maple, in this case, to try to remove them from the understory and promote regeneration of other tree species. So those two species in the northern forest can often suppress the regeneration of a more diverse forest. And so the question was, well, could we get goats in there to do some of that work, that thinning work? And the answer is yes, but the challenge was, the bark alone wasn't going to meet their nutritional needs. There's not a lot of other stuff in this case in the forest, and so they needed to be supplemented. So what they found in this study generally was that it was best to bring the goats in to do some of the stripping work for a few hours of the day, but then take them back out to pasture and feed them some supplements. That's when they did the best, right? So if you're going to target your animals in a specific application where you want them to do something, some kind of system where you bring them in and out or you bring in supplemental feed might be necessary, for this to be successful. So again, it all comes back to your goals, what you're trying to target, and if the focus is on the work they're doing, on the crop you're trying to produce from the tree, or potentially on the animal that you're trying to produce as a livestock product. Here's another farm in Ohio that I visited. That's that mischievous billy goat that I met. This is in a pawpaw forest at a farm that utilized this area, utilized the goats to keep the pawpaw understory open, so that they had good pawpaw regeneration, and also it was easy to harvest the fruit. In this case, the pawpaws themselves have a toxin in the leaves that actually discourage, or pretty much herbivores of all sorts won't touch them, won't browse on them, which is a unique feature to that tree. And so it's very easy then to integrate livestock as a mechanism to maintain the orchard. In this case, it's kind of a hybrid between more of a managed and a wild orchard, but worked quite well. And then here's a case where this is a farm up the road for me, this is a black locust plantation where the farmer is growing these trees initially for fence posts for his farm. Black locust is an incredibly rot-resistant wood, and also providing, of course, a nice understory. So black locust is very beneficial from a grazing perspective because it has it's a pretty light leaf structure, and so it lets a lot of light into the understory, which allows you to produce really nice forage in the understory. And so these were mostly midsummer paddocks where these black Angus cattle that he was raising could get some respite from the hot sun and graze some of this. And these grasses look phenomenal in August, which is often a time of year when the open pasture doesn't look so good. So again, after this farmer was done fencing his farm with the locust posts, he then started selling them at a profit locally, right? So this kind of mutually beneficial relationship works well. Locusts, in this case, can handle the trampling, these thousands and thousands of pounds of hoof impact. And that's an important trait when we think about the intersection of animals and trees, right? So those trees are well suited to that. He also planted black walnut, which were not as well suited and did not do as well in this system for that reason, amongst some others. I think the soil was also not the best. So all these kind of variables to think in mind. We certainly see the benefits of when things line up well. Pecan grazing has been really common. And so in the South, I should say, mostly in southern states, where we get a long and a short-term yield from the same system, and the cows, again, can create favorable habitat and support the system as a whole. So lots of different possibilities that got to be mutually beneficial. I'm going to skip over that for now and just provide a couple more examples since we're running short on time. So I mentioned timing, I mentioned intensity, and I mentioned matching the uniqueness of a cropping system or a management system to the animals themselves. So one of the things we learned I want to just share about with our mushroom operation was we went into this project really thinking we needed a kind of a uniform approach. We needed the ducks in there all the time. And one of the problems from a food safety standpoint is, we don't actually want the ducks in there when the mushrooms are fruiting. We don't need a bunch of fresh manure around our mushrooms. Mushrooms in particular are challenging because they don't really get washed in the same way that other produce does, because they're mostly water, and so we really have to clean them gently. So as we thought a bit more about what we were targeting, what we were after, what we learned is that if a slug was on a log or on a mushroom, it was too late. What we actually were trying to do was change the dynamic of a forest that was pretty damp and really supported the production of lots of slugs. And so what was more important is that we knocked back that population. We kept it knocked back. So what we realized is that before our main production season, which generally starts in June, we could get the ducks and the poultry in for what we called the spring cleanup, where they go through, they spend some time, and they actually eat larvae, eggs, and things like that. They sort of clean up the site. During the summer, we would put up some fencing, exclude them from the fruiting logs, and we would do what we call the duck moat. You can see these inner fences that are metal fences that would keep them away from the fruiting logs. And then we have the outer fence there in the background, which is the net fencing, which keeps them in the general area that we want. So we found that whenever we started to see a slug problem in particularly wet times, we could bring them in, we could exclude them from the crop, and we'd actually see a reduction in the slug population because we were still getting that effect of the larger kind of population effect on things. So we didn't actually need them in on the crop. We could use them in that way and again, this is during the months of like June through October. In the same way, our friends up the road have a wonderful cidery and really utilize both the technology and utilize their animals in different capacities at different times. So in the spring, they do not want the sheep in this case, to nibble on those tender buds, that soft, supple bark, very tempting to sheep. And so they do what's called a buffer, right? We keep the sheep out of the productive tree crop, and they graze the alleys, essentially in between the trees to get that job done. Then for the summer, they don't bring the sheep in at all. They bring in just geese. And what's wonderful about geese is they're not going to go after the trees, but they will go after the grass. And he's still kind of playing with this, but the orchard, my friend he thinks that, with the right density of geese, he could actually eliminate all summer mowing in his orchard because they will keep the grasses down, which would be great. And of course, they're still cycling fertility. And another wonderful thing about geese is they can actually forage for a good amount of their diet, especially if their goal is not for a livestock product, but it's actually for that ecosystem service, right? So there's a lot of lining up there of the amount of geese, the intensity, the size of the orchard, all these kind of things, but it can definitely happen. So that was the focus in the summer. And then in the fall, we kind of let the sheep in. They're not as interested. They don't feel as tempted by the trees that have recently gone dormant, but they are interested in all this fruit that's been left behind and kind of the residual stubble. And so they can be used to clean up drops in the orchard. And I think that this example, this is a smaller scale orchard, not a lot of animals. Again, the animals are there to support the orchard enterprise. They aren't focused on a meat or egg or geese enterprise or anything like that. The animals provide a support role for the system, and at the same time, the animals get to experience different ecosystems, different food sources, and meet their needs as well. So it doesn't all look uniform across the board. I think what's really important is the sort of seasonal shift and the sort of thinking about the differences that occur throughout different times of the year and how we utilize. So one question I saw on the notes, for instance, that were sent to me ahead of time was about wet areas. So for us, when we do our grazing plan, and that grazing plan is done, every year we update our grazing plan. It looks like a map with a bunch of paddocks drawn out. That's a nice, pretty picture to show folks, but it's never the plan that we follow, right? And so included in there are red squares and blue squares. And the red squares are paddocks that we think we can reliably graze every single time we rotate animals around the land. The blue paddocks, the blue squares, are the places that we might be able to graze if the timing is right. So wet areas on the property we consider in that blue zone, where if the conditions are right, if we have, let's say I'm around on the farm that day and I have time to put the animals in for a few hours and move them on, that's great, but I don't want to leave them in there for 24 hours because it might be too long or start to do damage to a riparian area, a wet area or something like that, right? So we plan our grazing with that knowledge that not all paddocks are created equal and that we have to be flexible with some of our spaces. And I think that's the take-home message with matching animals into the right context. So with that, I'm going to stop my slides, and I'd love to, if there's any questions, happy to answer a few in the time we have left, a few minutes here.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I don't know. Are you able to see the side panel now?
I can now. Yeah, now I stopped.
Okay. Awesome. So I don't know. Let's see, going back up, there's a bunch of communication about technical issues. So I think there was a question from David about woodlot trees affected by the disturbance pigs will do to the tree's fungal buddies.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So I think the short answer is we don't know enough because even mycorrhizal fungi in the forest are still being studied by themselves, and then the pig fungal interaction would be a whole other set of research. Unfortunately, one of the things I found from the book is that there's not enough research happening through universities and extension to answer all these questions. But what we do know is where those species like to live, and they like to live in that rich duff layer in the forest. And I have to say, we always think of pigs, but that example with the ducks, I found that even with too many ducks in the woods, they would really degrade that leaf litter layer really quickly. The forest is not designed with its mulching system, with its leaves, to handle heavy animal impact for too long. And so I would easily assume that if we see bare soil and we really are degrading that leafy duff layer, then we're having a major effect on the fungal networks that are existing. I think they can be resilient. I know they can sort of retreat back into the soil and probably regrow. but we're definitely not doing a service to them in the long term if we're having that kind of effect. So again, the kind of richer the forest, the deeper that layer, the healthier the woods. That might not be the place to put the animals. There's lots of kind of mid to low grade areas that might be better suited for it. The last thing I'll say about that is, again, just to think about the tree species and get to know which tree species are more shallow rooted, which might have a deeper root system. So sugar maple, for instance, or a lot of the pines, like pine plantations and things like that, have very shallow root systems. And so the more impact on them by things that like to root, like pigs, we're going to have a much more damaging effect than things like what we know about the Dehesa, for instance, is it was an oak tree based system. And oak trees, most of the root system is focused around a taproot, and so they can be much more resilient to that surface disturbance. So get to know your trees and how they grow and how they might be affected by that kind of disturbance.
Awesome. Okay. So a question from James, how do you prevent poultry from digging around trees very quickly? I'm not sure if you got to that. That was back up, 20 minutes ago in the session, but
yeah. You pick poultry that can't dig, so that's one. Is the web poultry would be a potential option for that. I think is really important. Or you move them really quickly. When I see really successful pastured poultry operations, they're usually moving their animals like once to 3 times a day, right? It's when we keep them in one place for too long that's just inevitably going to happen. So that would be my answer.
Great. Question from Marcy. How do you deal with E. coli contamination on food crops with ducks, etc., when they're in the food areas?
Yeah. I alluded to that, and I skipped over a slide because I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole. I did a webinar. It's actually posted on. It should be. I'll check after this webinar, but if not, it will be posted soon on the book page. But through the Savannah Institute, I did a food safety webinar, particular to silvopasture, because that's kind of a whole nother area. And so we talk about the rules and also the best practices for you to consider with timing and harvest and all that kind of stuff. So I'd recommend checking that out for a good look.
Awesome. That's great. Let's see. Do you see anything else in there? I'm just scrolling. There was a question about pigs grazing alongside goats. I think there was some discussion about that in the chat. I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think someone else kind of responded that they find that goats eat what grows after the pigs disturb the soil. So that's an important factor. Is when you have that disturbance and you have bare soil, what nature's going to try to work on, right, is growing something back to cover that soil back up. And in some cases, that could be a plant you like, and in many cases, it's a plant you don't like. So what I know, like Cliff Davis, I mentioned, his pig systems. A lot of folks who are thinking about this follow their pigs with a pretty extensive planting regimen, where they put down cover crop or seed or plant things that can regenerate really quickly intentionally to fill that void. And I think that's a big consideration. So again, just think about it as that disturbance. And if you have bare soil, if you don't put something there, then Mother Nature will, and it may not be something you want. So I think there's a way. I don't have experience with graze. I've worked with both animals. I don't have experience with like moving them together, and I'm not sure that's what your question, but the sort of successional sequencing, I think, is an interesting concept to potentially work with. So the thing I found with pigs is, and goats to a degree too, is a lot of the goats I worked with really prefer the woody browse. Is we don't have a lot of good information about what the quote unquote rest time is. So with our grazing livestock on pasture, our sheep and our cows, we can like really calculate or estimate very closely. Oh, I can probably bring these animals back in 30 days or in 50 days or something. But it's a lot harder with woody vegetation and with the sort of a disturbance that pigs can do to soil to say how many days until you can bring them back. But I think that one thing to consider is if you plant something, you can bring them back sooner, right? Because now there's something to hold the soil, to potentially feed them, and to work in, again. So it's all about what food is there.
Awesome. And so one last question, maybe we can get to a question about What tree do you find is most liked by sheep as a forage source? Different locusts,
Great question.
they're saying red bud.
Yeah. So again, on the Silvopasture book website, there's another past webinar that talks about tree fodder, because that's been a
Mm-hmm.
particular passion of mine. And we, on our homepage of our website, we have a report from last year where we actually did nutritional analysis for 6 different species that we planted or found on our land. So I wouldn't say there's one given species. What's really interesting about woody forages is they all provide what they provide that grasses and sort of pasture plants don't provide often is really dense concentrations of nutrients. So it's not like there's one plant that provides all of them. But for instance, honeysuckle actually turns out to, I think, be really, I'm not going to remember off the top of my head, but it's like really high in like manganese or something, right? Versus black locust was high in another trace nutrient. And so what it turns out to be is that the sheep really should have a little bit of all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And doesn't mean we have to go planting dozens and dozens of different species, but often whatever's in our landscape also offers that. So I would encourage digging into that, thinking about that more is better, and the diversity is really what you're after. And there's probably not one single, like, you actually don't want to feed just black locust to your sheep, because they'll potentially get bloat, because it's nutritionally very similar to alfalfa. And you don't want to, alfalfa is an amazing forage, but that's not the only thing you want your animals to eat. You want to balance that out with other things. So willow is very high in condensed tannins, which is great for rumen health and parasite resistance, right? So like a little bit of everything is kind of the short answer to it, without knowing the exact amounts of everything. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to let me just go back here. I'll send out, my webcam is working, a link to Steve's book website and to his farm website, so that you can kind of peruse all the resources and tools and handouts, past recorded webinars that he has there, in my follow-up email. I know that he has a lot of great stuff, but just a few housekeeping items. I know we're just about out of time. A reminder that there is a very short survey that's going to pop up on your screen as soon as I close out this webinar. If you are able to spend just a minute, it shouldn't take you more than a minute to fill it out, submit it, give us some ideas for future webinars, how this one went for you, ideas, and feedback, that'd be awesome. Like I said, a recording of this webinar will be available soon. I'll be sending it out tomorrow morning, along with the other webinars in this series. And then I had a request for the webinars in Sarah Flack's series, so I'll make sure to include those as well. Quick plug, we do have a bunch of webinars coming up, taking a little break between now and December, and then we'll be back in force in the winter. So check those out. I'll make sure that there's links to the registration pages. And the other things that FACT is offering right now, we have a couple of applications out there and open. Our Fund a Farmer grants, our mentorship program, both going on. Those are kind of more limited in time. Our scholarships are ongoing for any kind of winter conferences or events that you're looking to participate in, whether that's virtually or in person, depending on how that's looking. So on that note, I think that's about all the time we have for today. So I just want to thank you, Steve, again for being with us. And it's been really, an honor and a pleasure to have you back for the last couple of weeks. And I've enjoyed our discussions and your presentations. Thank you to everyone out there in the audience for your questions and for being so active and attentive and engaging about these really important topics. So I hope that we're all able to stay connected, and that I see you all on a webinar sometime soon in the future. So have a great afternoon, evening, and take care. Bye.